Chapter 8. I have never been sure whether to lay the blame for my aversion to school on the excruciating incident when my black bloomers were put on display for all the school to see, or if it was because, as modern-day psychiatrists would say, I was preconditioned. Mama couldn't understand my aversion. She said she loved school. Papa said that was because she didn't have any sisters. With that, he went on to tell about the horrors. On the day I got my first pair of schoolboy pants, my older sister, Ori, received her assignment to teach the first grade at the school. And Papa feigned despair. On the day I got my second pair of pants, my second sister, Alice, was assigned to teach the second grade. Both of my sisters claimed I was incorrigible, and every dinner conversation began with, "Do you know what Roy did in school today?" The problem was that general policy dictated that if a child got spanked at school, it was expected that he be spanked at home as well. With such wear and tear on the seat of my pants, it's a wonder that they lasted for a full year. Mama said he was stretching the truth as usual, and in defense of his sisters, she said that they must have given him a good basic education, because he graduated with honors from high school and from the University of Wisconsin. My actual school experience began one day when Mama and Mrs. Williams were busy sewing school dresses. Mrs. Boyce, according to reports from Portis, was out buying schoolboy pants, and everyone was seeking advice from Mrs. McNabb, who had sent Dunny off to school the year before. Having Fleur, Kat, and Portis all going together was a joyous occasion in the neighborhood. I didn't really understand what all the fuss was about until the day it happened. Then I realized with a jolt what it would mean for me. All day long I would be without my chief playmates. And what was I left with? Dor, who was a great bother and took up most of Mama's time, and Robbie, who was allowed to come over only on rare occasions. During those 2 years, I heard much more about the school experience when Fleur, Dunny, Kat, and Port, 4 advanced human beings, gathered after school on the back steps. They never tired of describing Miss Knight, the aged spinster, who ruled over the one-room schoolhouse located at 51st and Graham Street. Little Brighton housed the first and second grades and was a branch of the large elementary school located on the other side of the streetcar tracks on Rainier Avenue. Miss Knight's peculiarities were legend. She's got black hair and wears a black dress, and that's why she's got the name Miss Knight. And she's got a finger like the Wicked Witch in Snow White. Dunny shook his index finger into our faces. She shakes it at us for not paying attention, not putting forth our best effort, and not attending to our basic urges before she rings the school bell. Port snickered and explained basic urges, and the 1 and 2 finger signaling system. Her contract says she's got to give 1 spanking every day. She pulls the girls' dresses up so everyone can see their bloomers. I couldn't imagine anything worse, but evidently there was. When kids are really bad, she sends them to be punished by Mr. Dimwit. Mr. Dimwit, his name was actually Mr. Dimmitt, was the principal of Brighton School. Mrs. Williams said that few pupils had ever been sent to his office. Just the thought of the journey down Graham Hill, across the fearsome streetcar tracks, and 4 blocks along Holly Street where the perverts lived, was enough to push most students onto a righteous path. That first spring, we learned more about Miss Knight. Fleur and Kat came home with their dresses covered with yellow stains. Miss Knight had the whole school out picking dandelions. Both Mama and Mrs. Williams were angry. Dandelion stains are harder to get out than mud. Papa discussed the yellow stains with Mac. You don't suppose the spinster woman is making dandelion wine, do you? Oh, that couldn't be Roy. Wine is illegal. Well, who knows? The discussion continued. It seemed that teachers weren't like normal women. According to school policy, all teachers were required to be spinsters. That meant that they were not allowed to have a husband or boyfriend. And of course, no babies. They were supposed to devote all their energy to teaching other people's children. Sometimes this led to problems. It would be discovered that a teacher was secretly married or in a compromising situation. Either way, it was a scandal. The teacher would be fired, and the story would appear in the headlines. Mama wondered at the need for such a policy. Papa explained, "Having to cope with a man at the same time one is trying to cope with children weakens the brain." Mama said, "That must be my problem." From all I had heard of school, I figured I'd rather stay home and cut out paper dolls with Robbie, who was not crazy about dolls and preferred to ride his kiddie cars on our big front porch. However, I ruled over him, as I suppose Miss Knight ruled over Little Brighton. But the day came when I was supposedly past the doll stage. My introduction to school was terrifying. After Mama delivered me and left, I cried uncontrollably. I felt utterly abandoned. I didn't know another soul. Fleur and Kat and Port and advanced to Big Brighton. My first impression of Miss Knight confirmed all of the stories. Black from top to toe, she looked like the bad witch on Halloween. She addressed the wailing mob. The first graders will sit by the stove, and the second graders will sit by the window. After much shoving and pushing, the separation of the grades was accomplished. Miss Knight announced, "We will sit alphabetically." She glanced down at a sheet of paper. In a moment I heard her call out, "Frances Bigham, you are a bee." I was a bee. I didn't like bees. I had been stung by bees. "No, Mama," I began, but my voice was hoarse from yelling. "Mama, don't leave me." A great hand descended on my neck, dragged me toward the front of the room, and deposited me into the second seat of the first row. "I can hardly believe that you are Florence Bigham's little sister." Thus was the seating pattern for my 8 years in grade school established. Second seat under the spotlight of a teacher who delighted in comparing my shortcomings with the perfections of my big sister. Oh, to be allowed to sit in the back seat. Finally, Miss Knight introduced the subject I was already squirming in my seat about. She demonstrated the finger signals and reminded us that we were to perfect the processes related thereto. "Anticipate," she said. "Think ahead." The restrooms were a considerable distance from the main building. The girls' room was back-to-back with the boys' rooms, an arrangement that may have been easy on the plumbing, but was hard on the girls. We heard the voices of the second-grade boys through the thin wall. "Anything we flush down our toilet comes up in yours." "Yeah, we're flushing down another batch of snakes." Then they introduced another subject as disturbing as snakes, peepholes. From that day on, no girl was ever comfortable in the restroom. No sooner had we returned to class than one little girl, even shyer than I, demonstrated a lack of anticipation. As she stood there with her head hung low, Miss Knight explained about the endless problems she had created, wiping up the on-the-spot puddle and all the drips and dribbles that went from there down the aisle, out the door, down the steps, and along the sidewalk for however many blocks it took for the culprit to arrive at her home, where hopefully she would be beaten to within an inch of her life. Miss Knight addressed the class. "Do you want to be an old man or lady and still," here she used a word that Mama said we shouldn't use, but which we later found out was a perfectly respectable letter of the alphabet, "in your pants?" The poor girl didn't return to school that day, and so she completely missed the lesson on being neat, which made 2 lessons she didn't learn. "We shall learn to be..." Miss Knight had passed out papers and pencils, and had written something very precisely on the huge blackboard. The second graders parroted, "Neat." I broke out in a sweat. I could hear Papa defining the word. "Neat is something you ain't never been, Franny, and ain't never going to be." Although we students were expected to remain in our assigned seats, Miss Knight herself seldom lighted for more than a few minutes. She circulated between her desk, a sunny spot by the window, and a chair by the stove, which her second-grade boys attended. As long as she circulated, I was uneasy, waiting for her to come by and pounce on me. The only time I was at ease was about 10 o'clock every day, when Miss Knight had one of her favored students fetch a bottle that had been left on the front step by the milk truck. Sitting at her desk, she would consume the full pint and listen to us recite. She justified the indulgence by saying that it was doctor's orders. She claimed that liquids should be chewed the same as solids, so she would grind her teeth and slosh each mouthful around several times before swallowing. This took considerable time and made us all extremely thirsty. I found it very difficult reciting CAT spells cat to the sound of sloshing milk. Doctor's orders we discussed often. We knew that her health was poor, and we hoped that it was getting worse. We hoped, in fact, that it would get so bad that she would be unable to muster enough strength to participate in the disciplines. Unfortunately, her health was still good at the time of my great humiliation. It was springtime. I'm sure of that because we were close to the end of the alphabet. It had started out just like any other day. We had filed in at the ringing of the bell, deposited our coats in the dark cloakroom, marched into the large room, and slipped into our oak and black cast-iron desks. The first 10 minutes had been fairly routine. We stood up, sang the national anthem, and saluted the flag which hung from a pole by Miss Knight's desk. Then came lessons. Because of the split in grades, Miss Knight had to teach in shifts. If we were being taught, we were expected to pay close attention. If she was teaching the other section, we were to be working on our assignments. I often had a problem with that. It was so easy to just sit and look out the window at the birds and squirrels in the big oak trees, but on this day, I was working diligently. It wasn't long, however, before Miss Knight was scolding me. "Frances Bigham, will you stop squirming in your seat?" I began to explain, "Miss Knight, Mom, I am not squirming in my seat." Miss Knight was taken aback by my effrontery and for the moment couldn't say a word. I wanted to explain that although it may have looked like I was squirming, I indeed was not. I was diligently writing my S's. S was very troublesome for me. S is the letter the alphabet committee had made up to trick children who had figured they were close to the end of the alphabet and had become overconfident. My problem was that I couldn't figure out which direction my pencil should go after I had made the initial contact with the paper. If I started off in the wrong direction, I ended up with a bad-looking 2. Of course, it worked the other way around. When I was trying to make 2s, I usually ended up with bad-looking S's. I had finally got a clue when Miss Knight told us that the word stove began with an S. After that, I thought of my paper as the schoolroom. I made a dot by the stove, then a line all the way to the windows, then back down some imaginary stairs to the stove, and finally back again to the windows. It was a tedious process, and I had to get my whole body into it. Swing to the windows, swing to the stove. With all of this swing, I can't say that my S's were very neat, but at least they weren't bad-looking 2s. Miss Knight demanded, "Bring me your paper." She took one look and raised her voice a couple of octaves. I didn't get the gist of what she was saying, but I knew she expected an answer. Too frightened to ask for a repetition, I took a 50-50 chance and answered, "No?" Without any further ado, she grabbed me and threw me over her lap. I struggled furiously, but she overpowered me, pulled my dress way up over my head, and administered a long and painful series of blows. I was utterly humiliated. Throughout my whole life, I had made every effort to keep my black bloomers hidden from the world, especially from the boys in the first and second grades of Little Brighton. But now the whole world knew. On the way home, my new friend Helen Lewis tried to comfort me. "Why did you answer no?" she asked. I was still sniveling. I didn't know what she said. Helen explained, "She asked if you had put forth your best effort." I was still in the dark, but I knew that next time I was going to answer yes. Surprising as it may seem, Miss Knight had rewards for good behavior, which included such pleasures as clapping erasers and washing out her milk bottle. Unfortunately, she was the sole judge of good behavior, so I very seldom won the honors. One day, however, the index finger had stopped at me. "Frances Bigham, you may take my bottle." I leapt to my feet, took the bottle respectfully from her hands, and raced to the girls' room. I washed diligently, hoping that Miss Knight might discover that I had done the best job ever. "See what an excellent job Frances Bigham has done." With that, she would assign me permanently to the task, chief bottle washer, as Papa said. I was in a hurry. I wanted to get done before the snakes popped up out of the toilets. In my haste, I dropped the bottle. It splintered into a zillion pieces. In my fear, I lost all reason. I began scooping up the pieces, and in doing so inflicted a long gash on my hand. Blood spurted everywhere. I wrapped my hand in my hanky and began to run, rehearsing my lines. "I will pay for the bottle. I will scrub out the toilets." But before I got out the door, I envisioned the index finger pointing at me. "I am going to send you to Mr. Dimmitt." I turned back in confusion. I slumped in a corner as far away from the toilets as I could. I gave up any thought of going back. I could only wait for what I knew was coming. I'd heard the boys' proclamations a dozen times. "If I cut you with my knife, all your blood'll run out." I propped my head between my knees. I thought of how my family would miss me. Poor Mama. She'd say she never should have sent me to school in the first place. And Papa. I could picture him in the elevator of the Coleman building, going up to his office after the funeral. He would have big tears in his eyes as he'd tell the operator, "We lost our dear little Franny. She cut her hand, and all her blood ran out." Fortunately, before that dreaded happening, Miss Knight came to investigate. Oh, my precious girl. She ran for the white gauze, wrapped my hand, and sent me home, accompanied by Helen Lewis, who was very solicitous and kind and carried my hand all the way home. Papa was perturbed about the whole thing. He delighted in finding things about Miss Knight that made him perturbed. He felt she had used poor judgment in an emergency and proclaimed that she was too darn old to teach anyway. He threatened to take the matter up with the school board, but I don't think he did, because the next time he got perturbed with me, he declared that the whole thing had been my fault. When will you learn to stop being so clumsy? I can't say that I ever became Miss Knight's pet, but although I was never allowed to wash another bottle, I was allowed to clap erasers with regularity. Before I left Little Brighton, I had learned the alphabet from A to Z, but I didn't learn to stop dreaming. One day Miss Knight detected my preoccupation and demanded, "Frances Bigham, what are you dreaming about?" "I'm not dreaming, I'm wishing." Well, What are you wishing about? I'm wishing I was a Z. I didn't realize what a hit I had finally made with Miss Knight until the next year, when I went off to Big Brighton and Dor was enrolled at Little Brighton. On her first day she reported home, Miss Knight said, "I can't believe that you are nice Frances Bigham's little sister." Mama went to school to investigate, and when she came home she reported to Papa. Dor filled Miss Knight's galoshes with water. She said that she was just testing to see if they were waterproof. Papa said, "Could be worse, but not much."